So since we've had the release of a new Pokemon DLC for Scarlet and Violet in the last couple of weeks, I've decided that today is a good day to go back in time and look back at the past 27 years of Pokemon games and see how they compare against each other. Now, there's a literal metric ton of Pokemon games out there, and I'd probably reach the end of my life expectancy before I got through all of them, so I'm not going to be talking about 122 games one by one. Instead, I'm focusing entirely on which generation as a whole reigns supreme. More specifically, the mainline games in each generation, including the remastered ones such as Heart Gold and Soul Silver, or Fire Red and Leaf Green. So before anyone comes at me in the comments telling me how amazing Pokemon Stadium was, I know, but we're not talking about that today. So the first thing I want to say is that no matter how you slice it, there is no Pokemon game in the main line that is outright bad or unplayable. Even the worst of the games have moments that are genuinely enjoyable, and if you're a fan of Pokemon, they're still really good games to play because they follow that general Pokemon game cycle for the most part. But in my opinion, Gen 6 was the bottom of the barrel for me. It doesn't have anything overtly wrong with it, but it feels relatively flat to play through. Yes, it was the first 3D iteration of Pokemon, but you kinda can't help thinking that was the only real point of the game's release. It did introduce Mega Evolution, which was a fun yet slightly tedious feature of the game, and that brought certain Pokemon who probably would have been forgotten about some much needed limelight, like Mewar or Kangaskhan. But frankly, I just don't understand why Charizard needed two different Mega forms. I feel like it took away from another potential Pokemon receiving some much needed love. Maybe someone like a Flygon. But beyond the new Pokemon, the game itself is hindered by an extremely over-the-top story that's really hard to take seriously, and forgettable characters that just felt like cheap imitations of those from the past. The only saving grace of this generation of Pokemon was the remakes of Ruby and Sapphire, which I enjoyed a lot, but even then, I feel like Game Freak missed a step by not remaking them with the Emerald storyline, because Emerald is by far the superior game of the three. And ultimately, apart from allowing you to fly through Hoenn on Latios or Latias, and the introduction of Primal forms for Groudon and Kyogre, there's nothing I really remember being added to these games. But sadly, what I do remember though is the generation that still has people ranting about it to this day, Generation 8, which I believe is still one of the most controversial gens of Pokemon after what is famously known as Dexit. And if you didn't play Sword and Shield and don't know what Dexit is, let me explain it to you. Game Freak deemed it necessary to release Sword and Shield after removing literal hundreds of Pokemon that fans know and love for no apparent reason, and then made it worse by sprinkling in random Pokemon from every other generation that I don't think anyone wanted, requested, or cared about. The game felt linear, the story wasn't fantastic, and I'm still not entirely sure where Eternatus' face actually is, but what Pokemon Sword and Shield did do very well was the implementation of what I believe to be one of the best things a Pokemon game has ever had, the wild area. A big open space where Pokemon run free at incrementing levels depending on how far you've progressed in the story, and I can't tell you how long I spent in here catching Pokemon in different weather types and being destroyed by colossal walking Rhydons that were significantly higher leveled than I could ever have wished to be, but it was fun. A really fun area that felt let down by the game around it, that was full of visual glitches and trees that became pixelated and two-dimensional as soon as you got close to them, and a story that left so much to be desired. The DLC saved it a little bit by adding new areas and some of the much-loved Pokemon of the past, and the introduction of Dynamax Adventures was a fun little activity if you enjoy hunting for shinies like I do. But again, the story felt too linear and it just wasn't entertaining. Obviously, in this generation, we also got remasters of Diamond and Pearl from Gen 4 in a weird new chibi art style, and they were good games. But honestly, they didn't really add anything from the originals other than some Pokeball stickers. And that was really disappointing, to say the least. And while we're on the topic of controversial things, Gen 7 gets so much hate for being as experimental as it was. It changed the whole game cycle of Pokemon in such a dramatic way by taking out gyms and replacing them with island trials in Pokemon Sun and Moon. Now, I know a lot of people were disappointed with this fact, but personally I found it refreshing. Sure, it's a ballsy move to change the structure of Pokemon because most of us were so used to the way it played, but we need to give it credit where it's due, because if you really invest your time into them, Sun and Moon had an incredibly good story and were filled with characters that I actually remember years after last playing it. The problem I do have with it and why it's so low on my ranking system is due to the influx of so many features and changes. The first few hours are a slog, filled with tutorials and a lot of things to absolutely waste your time. So much so that by the time you actually get to playing, you're in a terrible mood. But if you manage to fight your way through the intense boredom of the start, what you end up with is a really fun set of games with interesting new Pokemon and even more interesting forms of older Pokemon like Vulpix and Exeggutor, who still has a slight issue with fitting on the screen. I also really enjoyed the introduction of Ultra Beasts. Sure, they're bonkers and a couple of them have a few design issues, but on the whole, they're a pretty cool addition that I had a load of fun trying to catch back in the day as I surfed through space on my legendary Pokemon. Following that, the release of Ultra Sun and Moon added a little more meat to the base game by implementing new Pokemon forms, the ability to catch older Pokemon from the past, and a story that was slightly more centered towards Necrozma. But as interesting as these games were, they're not ones I'd go back and replay. Maybe if there was a way to skip the first few hours of tutorials and mind-numbing nonsense, then I'd go back to these games quite often. But unfortunately, this isn't the case and it really lets it down. So it's not winning any awards for me personally. And since we're discussing awards, the award for potentially the most polarizing of all Pokemon gens goes to Gen 1. There are sections of the fandom that still love these games and a large section that thinks they're extremely stinky, and I get it, because at a glance these games are fundamentally broken for a number of reasons. They're riddled with glitches, the gameplay is insanely simplistic, and there really isn't a story to speak of. Not to mention around your 5th gym you'll learn exactly what it feels like to be one-shot extremely quickly. I'm looking at you, Sabrina. But every one of those things can be so easily explained. Of course the gameplay is simplistic, it's the first iteration of a series and it's on a console that didn't really have that much firepower behind it. And beating Sabrina's psychic battering is actually quite easy if you catch a Haunter in Lavender Town. No, it doesn't have a story and that is disappointing in a sense, but nobody really speaks about what Gen 1 did so perfectly. It created the foundation of every other Pokemon game that we've been blessed with over the past 27 years. It has a roster of Pokemon that, sure, it's limited in parts, but it's so damn lovable. Nobody can understate how iconic these Pokemon are, and as much as a large proportion of them are barely usable in a fight, they're my childhood, and I have an immense soft spot for all of them regardless of their usefulness. I spent hours every day grinding the game corner on Pokemon Blue in the hopes of making enough coins on the Rigdar slot machine to finally get a Dratini, and I remember how long it took me to finally catch an Abra without it teleporting away. But honestly, I had fun doing these things, so it's incredibly hard for me to hate on it. It is really simple, and yes, it aged like milk in the Sahara Desert, but simple doesn't have to be a bad thing. It deserves the credit for everything it created. And on the other side of the spectrum, newest iterations Pokemon Scarlet and Violet are the complete opposite. For years, fans begged for a free-roam Pokemon game, and Game Freak dangled a carrot in front of our faces with the wild area from Sword and Shield. And yes, that was definitely progress, but when the announcement for Scarlet and Violet said it was going to be fully open world, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't incredibly excited. And now I can genuinely say, after putting in hundreds of hours into this game, that I genuinely believe it's propelling Pokemon in the right direction, because the grand scale of Pokemon and the wonder it produces is so much more evident when you carve your own path. And I think this game does a wonderful job of instilling that emotion in you. And when you add in the newer features like sandwich making, which is a simplistic task that gives benefits from increased catch rates of certain types to easier shiny hunting, these games have a lot to offer. Don't get me wrong, they're far from perfect. They run about as fast as an 85-year-old in certain areas, and honestly, the whole thing felt a little bit too easy. I don't remember any point in the game where I genuinely struggled to beat a gym or a wild Pokemon, and that led to me completing the main story really quickly. But I did really enjoy doing it. Obviously, I can't fully judge this generation as of yet, as the second part of the DLC is not being released till 2024, but from what I've played so far, and from what I've seen of the next part of the DLC, this really could be epic. And epic is a word I would also use to describe Generation 2. Now, in my opinion, Gold and Silver took the recipe that Game Freak used for Gen 1 and then just added some much needed seasoning to the dish. First and foremost, it aged dramatically better than Gen 1 did. Albeit, no, not flawlessly by any means, but I remember enjoying it so much more than the first generation. The added splashes of colour made the world feel a little bit more vibrant, and the inclusion of new evolutions of Pokemon like Cypher, Seadra and Slowbro, alongside the introduction of 2 new Pokemon types in Dark and Steel, really freshened the game up, giving you a lot more choice in who would make up your team, and allowed you so many more options in terms of building your team against certain threats. Granted, the Johto gym leaders were forgettable, and the level curve of the game is mind-boggling to me even now, with the final gym leader Claire's strongest Pokemon Kingdra sitting at a measly level 40 that by the time you've collected 8 badges, you really don't feel like you've trained that much. But overall, they felt a lot more balanced, and the ability to beat the Pokemon League and then go back to Kanto to fight the original 8 gym leaders from Red and Blue was an incredible touch that showed the original areas and Pokemon in such a different light, and it reinforced Pokemon Gold and Silver as dramatic improvements on the original games. Which brings us into the top 3, and in my opinion, these 3 generations are so far ahead of the others in so many ways. Starting off with Generation 3, and oh, what games Ruby and Sapphire were. The first Pokemon games on the new high-tech Game Boy Advance with full brightly coloured worlds and a host of new additions, such as dynamic weather, Pokemon abilities, and dual typing. Not to mention 135 new Pokemon that really propelled these games forward and changed the way you had to approach the games and the battles within them. Yeah, the removal of backwards compatibility was a sore point for me and a lot of others, but in a way, it allowed Pokemon to leave its past behind and move on to bigger and better things. I believe it was the perfect step in the right direction, and even after 21 years of release, I really don't know a lot of people who have any glaring complaints with these games. They felt refreshing and grand, and the implementation of 2 evil groups, Team Magma and Team Aqua, both fighting each other over the correct way to destroy the world, just made the game feel a lot fuller. This was also the first set of games that really showcased the immense power of the legendary Pokemon within them, as the moment they awake, the whole region of Hoenn changes depending on what version of the game you have. And I really liked that touch. But in my opinion, what really made Gen 3 shine was the release of Pokemon Emerald, which follows the same basic principle as Ruby and Sapphire, except now both teams awaken their legendary Pokemon, to which you get the wonderful job of waking up Rayquaza to break up the fight. And of course, not forgetting the remakes of the first gen in Fire Red and Leaf Green, both of which take the formula from Generation 1 and just honestly made it better, implementing Pokemon from Generations 2 and 3 and allowing so much more to do with the inclusion of the Sevi Islands in the post-game and making numerous quality of life changes that just made playing them feel smoother and more rewarding. And while Generation 3 was a big step up for the time, Gen 5 took everything before it and created something truly remarkable. This is one of the very few generations that I honestly can't find much of a flaw in, and after playing these games, you can instantly tell this was the height of Game Freak's power when it came to Pokemon. Displaying incredible visuals and impressive animations and sprites, not to mention the surprisingly intricate and complex storyline that actually made you feel like you were in genuine danger. I admit, when I first played it, a part of me was disappointed not to see some of the Pokemon from older gens since they're locked behind defeating the Elite Four. But in hindsight, it allowed me to really appreciate the 158 new Pokemon that Black and White added, some of which have become some of my favourite Pokemon nowadays. Black and White also introduced us to the newest iteration of evil in Team Plasma, who are so much more complex than the usual Pokemon villains, somehow managing to mix their manipulative, vile nature with their end goal of liberating Pokemon and keeping them free, which was an absolute refreshing change from the generic destroy the world trope that we're used to. Gen 5 also gifted us with Black and White 2, which, yeah, granted, it didn't really add much to the first set of games in terms of features, but what it did add was a genuinely good follow-up story that acted as a perfect sequel to the first set of games, and I really can't fault that. They are extremely difficult to outclass, and honestly, I was toying with the idea of putting this in my number 1 spot, but I feel like one generation slightly pips it to the top, and that generation is Generation 4. Now, don't get me wrong, I know a lot of people have a problem with Gen 4, and I do understand it, because Diamond and Pearl do have glaring issues with them. They have an incredibly limited pool of new Pokemon coming in at 107, which, yeah, it may sound like a lot, but when you factor out that 14 of them were legendaries and 27 were either evolutions or pre-evolutions, you're only left with 66 new Pokemon to choose from, and that does leave you finding the same Pokemon on repeat quite often. Beyond that, the games do feature an extremely forgettable story that is mediocre at best, and they do feel extremely sluggish, especially when battling due to a weird delay that the HP bar has, causing it to take about 10 years to deplete a Pokemon's health. So if Diamond and Pearl were the only games that Gen 4 released, then this would be floating very close to the bottom of my list. But after an extremely questionable start, we were gifted a masterpiece in Pokemon Platinum. Now, Platinum immediately fixed every issue I had with Diamond and Pearl, creating a more fluid and streamlined version with a drastically altered story that focused the majority of its attention on Giratina, and adding in copious new features such as the Wi-Fi Plaza, the ability to catch legendary birds from Generation 1, and the ability to traverse a distortion world in which you can find and catch a new form of Giratina. And due to the fact they fixed the speed issue, you finally got the opportunity to appreciate just how enjoyable the vividly coloured Sinnoh was to explore and train in. And unlike the Pokemon games of the past, Team Galactic were actual psychopaths. By this point in the Pokemon world, we were used to teams vying for power and making evil threats, but to have people who genuinely wanted to blow up the universe, it made everything you did in Pokemon Platinum feel like it mattered. And in my opinion, this is the perfect release by Game Freak. And if all of that wasn't enough, we were then treated yet again in Gen 4 with the insanely impressive remakes of Gen 2 in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, which, similarly to the Gen 1 remakes, took everything from Gen 2 and just propelled it upwards at great speed, adding in amazing quality of life changes such as being able to use abilities and moves from Gen 4, adding in final evolutions that didn't exist during the originals like Togekiss and Mamoswine, and dramatically helping the level curve, which was a huge game changer in my books. Gen 4 may have started shakily, but the sheer volume of absolute bangers that followed Diamond and Pearl make Gen 4 unbeatable in my mind. Yeah, the story isn't as intricate as Gen 5 and it definitely isn't as pretty to look at, but Gen 4 just resonated with me in a way that no other generation could, and for that it just had to top my list. I'm sure some of you will disagree, so please let me know in the comments what order you would put them in, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos like this in the future. And if you hit the bell, you'll always be notified whenever I make a new video. So that's pretty neat, right? Thank you all so much for watching and have a wonderful day. I'll see you next time. Peace out.